There is a specific temperature in a room when a corporate execution is about to take place. It is not cold, not exactly. It is more like the sterile chill of a server room, dry and smelling faintly of ozone and stale coffee. I sat in the third row of the Apex Defense Solutions conference hall, smoothing the lapel of my charcoal suit. Around me, 70 of my colleagues sat in matching ergonomic chairs, shifting their weight, eyes darting anywhere but the stage. At the podium stood Preston Cole. He was 35, wore a micro-fleece vest over a tailored dress shirt, and had the nervous, high-frequency energy of a man who believed the world could be solved with a software patch and a subscription model. He had been appointed Chief Executive Officer 3 months ago, flown in by the board of directors to refresh our talent stack. I had been at Apex Defense Solutions for 15 years. I was 55, gray at the temples, and possessed a quiet record of keeping our most volatile, highly regulated federal defense contracts in perfect alignment with the law. To Preston, however, I was a line item. I was legacy overhead, a dinosaur who spent too much time reading regulatory guidelines and not enough time posting on LinkedIn. Preston tapped the microphone. The high-pitched feedback cut through the room like a razor blade. He smiled, that wide, empty grin he usually reserved for investor presentations. He spoke into his lapel microphone, his voice bouncing off the acoustic tiles. "We have made the difficult decision to streamline our operations," he announced, his tone light and conversational, as if he were explaining a minor shift in a project timeline. Streamline. It is a clean word for a messy process. He clicked a button on his remote and a slide projected behind him. It was a list of names. My name was fourth. I watched it sit there, illuminated in crisp white pixels, Julian Vance. Underneath it, smaller text thanked me for my years of service. Preston did not look at me. He was already talking about our lean future, about building a more agile organization that could pivot in the defense contracting market. The room was silent, save for a few polite robotic claps from the human resources staff standing near the exit doors. Someone next to me whispered that I would bounce back. I did not answer. My hands went cold, the familiar physical reaction I get whenever I am about to make a decision that will alter the course of several lives. I did not make a scene. When the meeting adjourned, I did not wait for the human resources representative to hand me the cardboard box and the branded stress ball. I walked straight to the elevators, ignoring the sympathetic glances from the junior analysts. I stepped into the elevator cabin, pressed the button for the ground floor, and pulled out my smartphone. The elevator began its smooth descent. I unlocked my phone, opened the secure browser, and navigated to the federal compliance portal. I bypassed the two-factor authentication, completed the biometric thumb scan, and typed in my 20-character security passphrase. The system initialized a secure session. I scrolled down to Form 1916B. The form was simple, but its weight was immense. It was the official notification of a status change for a designated responsible officer. I selected my name and changed the status to inactive, effective immediately. As soon as I clicked the button, a warning prompt appeared on the screen in bright gray text. It warned me that submitting this form would notify the Defense Contract Management Agency and trigger an automated stop work order on all active contracts requiring active compliance oversight. I did not hesitate. I tapped the confirm button. The elevator doors slid open. I walked out into the afternoon heat of Arlington, Virginia. What Preston and his newly minted executive team had failed to realize was that I was not just a senior administrator who organized folders. I was the legally registered responsible officer for every federal defense contract Apex Defense Solutions held. Under Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically the sections governing security clearances and contractor oversight, a defense firm must have an active, certified responsible officer to maintain access to federal databases and classified systems. If that officer is terminated or leaves the position, the company has exactly 24 hours to notify the government and designate a qualified successor. If they fail to do so, or if the officer reports their own departure before a successor is certified, the system automatically freezes all active work. It is a hard stop designed to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive government data. It is not a policy guideline. It is federal law, and it has teeth. By the time I reached my car in the parking garage, my personal email was pinging. Human Resources had already sent my separation summary along with a digital exit survey, asking for my feedback on the transition experience. I deleted it without reading. I turned off my mobile phone, placed it in the glove compartment, and drove home. I was looking forward to the quiet. I knew the silence would not last long, but I wanted to enjoy it while it belonged to me. The executives at Apex Defense Solutions had spent months planning how to cut my salary from the budget, but they had not spent even 5 minutes looking at the legal framework that kept their entire business alive. They believed the systems ran on magic, or perhaps on the sheer force of Preston Cole's ambition. They were about to learn that the system ran on rules, and those rules were written in ink that had my signature on it. I parked my car in my driveway, walked into my house, and closed the front door behind me. The storm was coming, and I was finally in a place where I could watch it rain without getting wet. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the first cracks in the wall began to show. I was sitting at my kitchen table, dressed in a comfortable linen robe, slowly stirring a spoonful of honey into my black tea. I had turned my personal phone back on, placing it on the counter. It did not take long for the notifications to start. A text message from Diana Brooks, a project supervisor I had worked with for 8 years, was the first to arrive. She was asking if I had heard anything about Project Merlin. The engineers were reporting that they were locked out of the secure federal cloud environment, unable to access the code repositories or the testing databases. Diana had always been a sharp engineer, the kind of person who focused on her tasks and avoided the corporate politics that plagued the upper levels. We had spent countless late nights together preparing for the annual Department of Defense audits, ensuring that every line of code complied with federal security directives. By 9 o'clock, another message arrived, this time from a database administrator on the East Coast team. He reported that the entire development environment was displaying a compliance flag on the login screen, denying access to all users. I did not reply. I took another sip of my tea and watched the notifications stack up on the screen like wooden blocks. At exactly 10 o'clock, the quiet detonation reached the executive suite. A formal notice from the Defense Contract Management Agency landed in the email inbox of Walter Jennings, the company's general counsel. It was a brief, unadorned message written in standard federal typeface. It referenced Title 48 and Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically the sections that mandated strict security and cyber incident reporting guidelines for defense contractors. The notice stated that because Apex Defense Solutions had failed to maintain an active, certified responsible officer to oversee the secure databases, the company was no longer considered compliant for work involving regulated federal defense contracts. The automated stop work order was already in effect, having been triggered at 5 o'clock the previous evening, exactly 27 minutes after I had submitted the status change form in the elevator. The notice also outlined the accrued penalties for non-compliance, which amounted to exactly $100,000 per hour. For every hour the contract remained in a suspended state inside the corporate headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from sleek professionalism to absolute chaos. I knew exactly what was happening in the development bays. Project managers were running between offices, demanding to know why their developers could not access the code repositories. The systems administrators were attempting to apply administrative overrides, but every attempt was met with the same cold, gray text on the screen. Action denied. Responsible officer credential required for override. No backup officer had been assigned to the system. Why would they? Preston Cole had cut the compliance department budget by 30% to fund a new marketing campaign, and he had assumed that my role was merely ceremonial, a box-checking formality that could be easily automated or outsourced to a junior clerk. He did not understand that I had spent 15 years weaving my credentials into the very architecture of their networks. Without my active cryptographic token, the entire system was a locked room with no windows, and the keys had walked out the door with me. By noon, the panic had reached LinkedIn. Several junior developers had already updated their profiles to indicate they were open to work, a clear sign that they recognized the ship was taking on water. My private inbox on the platform was filling up with messages from former colleagues. Some were casual, asking how I was doing after the public announcement, while others were more direct, asking if I knew why the federal portal was rejecting their security clearance tokens. I read them all, but I did not type a single character in response. This was not a matter of anger or petty revenge. It was a matter of gravity. If you remove the keystone from an arch, the stones do not fall because they are angry at the builder. They fall because gravity demands it. I had been the keystone for 15 years, absorbing the weight of their regulatory compliance while they stood underneath the arch and bragged about their growth. Now, they were about to discover how heavy those stones really were. I walked out to my back garden carrying my teacup. The weather was clear, a warm Virginia morning that felt entirely disconnected from the emergency board meetings, surely taking place in the glass offices in Arlington. I could picture Preston Cole, sweating through his custom-tailored dress shirt, staring at the running clock on his laptop screen as the hourly fines accumulated. $100,000 an hour was not a figure the company could ignore, not even for a single day. The quarterly margins they had bragged about to the investors were evaporating in real time. My lawyer had already been notified of my termination, and I knew he was waiting for the inevitable phone call from Walter Jennings. I was in no hurry. I had 15 years of accumulated vacation pay to collect, a comfortable house, and a garden that needed attention. The executives had wanted a leaner, more agile company. They had finally gotten exactly what they asked for, and they were finding out that agility is a very cold comfort when you are falling. By Friday morning, the delusion of a quick fix had completely vanished. The corporate executives had spent the previous 24 hours attempting to bypass the federal security protocols, believing that a combination of IT wizardry and executive pressure could force the system to bend. Oliver Finch, the chief technology officer, had waddled into the emergency war room at 8 o'clock, carrying a half-eaten protein bar and looking as though he had not slept in 2 days. He had assured Preston Cole that his senior network engineers could force a local database update to replace my name with an internal candidate, who possessed the basic clearance levels but lacked the specific federal credentials. The engineers spent 4 hours attempting to override the GRC database cache, but the federal server rejected every request with mechanical precision. Several network administrators threw up their hands in frustration, complaining that they could not access the security logs or run the necessary tests without my physical token. The system was designed to resist unauthorized modifications, and each failed attempt was logged and transmitted directly to the Department of Oversight. By noon, a second warning flag had appeared on the administrator console. Unauthorized responsible officer replacement attempt logged. Reinstatement protocol frozen pending manual agency review. While Oliver Finch was failing to hack the federal government, Bradley Croft, the chief financial officer, was running the numbers. He sat in his office, his cardigan wrapped tightly around him, staring at a spreadsheet that was turning rapidly red. He had calculated the direct cost of the stop work order, and the figures were terrifying. The company employed 70 developers on the federal contracts, each earning an average salary of $120,000 per year. And all of them were now sitting completely idle, unable to write a single line of billable code. When he added the contract non-compliance penalties, the lost development milestones, and the potential liquidated damages from the prime contractors, the total daily loss exceeded $2,400,000. He drafted an internal memo to the board of directors, copying Preston Cole. The subject line was written in capital letters: Urgent compliance issues and financial exposure. At the top of the document, he had placed a digital counter that tracked the financial losses in real time, showing that the company was bleeding money at an alarming rate that threatened its financial liquidity. It was a theatrical touch, but Bradley was desperate. The company was losing more money in a single day than my annual salary had cost them over the last decade. The phone on my kitchen counter began to ring at 9 o'clock. It was the first of 17 missed calls I would receive that day. 12 were from the Human Resources Department, 3 were from the legal office, One was from the chief operating officer, and the final call came directly from Preston Cole's personal office. I did not answer any of them. I had silenced the ringer, letting the calls roll quietly into voicemail. I listened to one message from the head of human resources, her voice tight, high-pitched, and filled with a forced cheerfulness that did not match the situation. She suggested that there had been a minor administrative misunderstanding regarding my transition package and that they were eager to discuss a mutually beneficial consulting arrangement to assist with system maintenance. I deleted the voicemail. I also listened to a message from Walter Jennings, who sounded exhausted and old. He did not try to negotiate. He simply asked me to call him back at my earliest convenience to discuss the compliance status. They did not want to discuss a package. They wanted my signature on Form 1916C, the voluntary transfer of authority. Without that signature, the federal government would not accept any new designation for 6 calendar months. I opened my laptop, but I did not log into the company network. Instead, I navigated to my LinkedIn profile. I clicked the edit button on my current position, scrolling down to the entry for Apex Defense Solutions. I removed the title of Senior Compliance Officer. In its place, I typed a new designation, Independent Compliance Consultant. Underneath the title, I wrote a single clear line, specializing in federal risk strategy, regulatory recovery, and defense contract compliance for select engagements only. Within 45 minutes of saving the changes, the traffic to my profile had tripled. I could see the names of the people viewing my page. Corporate recruiters from major defense firms, compliance directors from competing defense contractors, and 2 senior partners from an international consulting group. The industry was small, and the news of the stop work order at Apex Defense Solutions had already begun to circulate through the Arlington Defense Corridor, raising serious questions about the company's leadership and long-term stability. As the afternoon sun shifted across my desk, I received a text message from a former colleague in the procurement office. He told me that the company's internal communication channels were in a state of complete collapse. The developers had posted a digital image of a sinking ship on the general Slack channel, and it had received nearly 90 reactions before the administrators deleted the post. Preston Cole had issued a company-wide message urging everyone to remain focused and resilient during this period of temporary regulatory turbulence. It was classic corporate language, empty of meaning and entirely detached from the reality of the situation. The reality was that the company was bleeding 6 figures every hour. Their prime contractors were preparing to declare a material breach, and the only person who could stop the bleeding was currently sitting at home, reading a historical biography on his patio and drinking hot tea. On Monday morning, the situation escalated from an expensive crisis to a fatal threat. A major government agency officially notified Apex Defense Solutions that it was terminating a $14 million contract, which had been scheduled to launch in the 4th quarter. The contract represented the core of the company's revenue projections for the entire fiscal year and was critical for maintaining investor confidence. The project involved migrating sensitive tactical logistics data to a secure cloud platform, a task that required continuous compliance monitoring. The official letter was signed by a regional procurement director, and its language was cold. Due to the contractor's failure to maintain a certified responsible officer in compliance with federal acquisition regulations, this agency is invoking its right to terminate the agreement for cause, effective immediately. The news hit the executive offices like a physical blow. The company's stock value, traded on a private exchange for major defense investors, began to drop rapidly as shareholders realized the company could no longer legally execute its federal obligations. The office corridors were filled with hushed, anxious whispers as employees began to realize that their jobs were no longer secure. At 10 o'clock, Victoria Thorne, the chief operating officer, bypassed the standard channels and called me from an unlisted number. I answered, expecting it to be my lawyer, but her voice came through the speaker instead. She was polite, professional, and had the smooth, practiced tone of an executive who had spent her career delivering bad news with a smile. "Julian," she said, "we need to bring this to a resolution. We are prepared to offer you an independent consulting contract." We will triple your previous hourly rate, allow you to work entirely from home, and grant you full discretion over your schedule. All we require is your signature on the transition documents and your assistance with the system restoration. We can make this very simple for everyone involved. I listened to her finish, feeling the absolute lack of warmth in her words. She was the same person who had stood next to Preston Cole during the layoff announcement, nodding in agreement as he spoke about refreshing the talent. They did not want a resolution. They wanted to buy my compliance so they could pretend the crisis had never happened, hiding their incompetence behind a stack of non-disclosure agreements. I did not argue with her on the phone. I did not tell her that she was 3 days too late. I simply informed her that I was open to reviewing any formal proposals in writing, provided they were sent directly to my legal counsel. I gave her my attorney's office number and hung up the phone. 15 minutes later, my attorney called to confirm that Victoria Thorne's assistant had already emailed a draft agreement. He told me the terms were desperate. The contract included a strict non-disclosure clause that would prevent me from ever speaking about the circumstances of my departure or the nature of the stop work order. They were trying to contain the damage, to build a wall of legal documents around the fire they had started. I told my lawyer to reject the draft and to inform them that we would only negotiate once a complete, unconditional proposal was submitted, free of any restrictive covenants that would limit my future consulting opportunities or prevent me from cooperating with federal audits. While Victoria Thorne was trying to negotiate a settlement, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the executive boardroom. According to an email forwarded to me by a friend in the legal department, Preston Cole had called an emergency meeting of the senior directors. He was red-faced, exhausted, and desperate to shift the blame to someone else. He had spent the meeting arguing that the crisis was an administrative failure, pointing fingers at the human resources director and the chief technology officer, claiming that they should have anticipated the network lockout. When the general counsel, Walter Jennings, explained that the system was legally locked until I voluntarily signed the transfer, Preston had lost his temper. He had looked around the room and suggested that they simply sign the documents on my behalf, claiming that my departure had been a mutual agreement and that the signature was a formality that did not require my physical presence. The room had gone completely silent. Walter Jennings, who was normally a quiet policy expert, who avoided conflict and wore orthopedic shoes to manage his chronic back pain, had stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. He placed his hands flat on the table, looked directly at Preston Cole, and spoke in a voice that was cold and absolute. "That is a federal felony," he said, his voice trembling slightly with anger. "It is forgery of a federal compliance document, violating Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code, and it carries a minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. I will not discuss that option, and if anyone in this room attempts to execute it, I will immediately report it to the authorities, resign from this company, and testify against you in court." Preston had stared at him, his mouth open, but he did not say another word. The reality had finally reached him. He could not bully, slide, or lie his way out of the rules. He needed my voluntary signature, and he had absolutely nothing to trade for it except his own survival. The final meeting took place on Tuesday morning in the main boardroom of Apex Defense Solutions. The executives had agreed to my terms for a face-to-face discussion, though my attorney had made it clear that I would not be arriving on their schedule. Before I left my house, my lawyer had called to review our strategy, reminding me that I held all the cards and that I should let the silence work for us in that boardroom. He advised me to remain completely calm, allowing their own panic to drive the negotiation. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock. I walked through the double doors at exactly 23 minutes past the hour, refusing to let them control the pace of the discussion. I was not rushing. I wore a dark gray suit, a light blue shirt, and carried a simple leather notebook. The room was crowded. Every member of the board of directors was present, along with Victoria Thorne, Bradley Croft, Walter Jennings, and Preston Cole. The air in the room was heavy, smelling of cold coffee and the distinct scent of corporate panic. Preston was standing near the window, looking out over the Arlington skyline. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his face was pale and drawn, a stark contrast to the arrogant young executive who had announced my termination just a few days earlier. As soon as I sat down at the table, Preston Cole turned and pointed a finger at me. His voice was high-pitched, tight with 3 days of unreleased anger. "You have no idea the damage you have caused to this organization," he shouted. "You have cost us millions of dollars, ruined our relationship with our clients, and put 70 jobs at risk because of a personal grievance. It is a complete violation of your professional duties, and we will hold you legally accountable." I did not look at him, nor did I answer. Instead, Walter Jennings stood up from his seat, reached out, and grabbed Preston Cole's arm with a firm grip. "Sir, stop!" the lawyer said, his voice low but cutting through the room like a cold wind. "Julian Vance is the only person in this room who can sign the reinstatement form. If you continue this line of discussion, it can be legally construed as coercion, which will invalidate any agreement we reach. Sit down." Preston stared at him, then slowly let his hand drop and sank back into his chair, looking completely defeated. I opened my leather notebook, clicked my silver pen, and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. I slid it across the polished wood toward the chairman of the board. The document contained 3 simple bullet points, written in clear, unambiguous language. The first point required a 7-figure severance payout, wired to my account within 48 hours. The second point required the complete retroactive reinstatement of all my benefits, including my health insurance, retirement contributions, and stock options, backdated to the morning of my termination. The third and final point was the most important: the immediate resignation of Preston Cole as Chief Executive Officer, effective before the ink on my signature was dry. The chairman read the document, his face showing no emotion, then passed it to the other directors, who reviewed the terms with grim expressions, whispering among themselves in hushed, panicked tones about the severe financial exposure they faced. The silence in the room was absolute. I watched the directors exchange looks. They were calculating the cost. The company had already lost $14 million in contracts, and the daily fines were continuing to accumulate at $100,000 an hour. The cost of my demands was high, but it was a fraction of what they would lose if the stop work order remained in place for another week. If they refused, I would file a formal notice of permanent unwillingness to return, which would lock the responsible officer designation for 6 months under Clause 9A of the Compliance Charter. That would be the end of Apex Defense Solutions. The board chair looked at the other directors, saw them nod, and then turned back to me. "We accept the terms," he said simply. The chairman of the board did not hesitate. He took his own fountain pen, signed the corporate severance and benefit agreement on behalf of Apex Defense Solutions, and slid it back to my side of the table. He then turned his cold, hard gaze toward Preston Cole, sliding a second document across the table. Preston looked around the room, hoping to find a single ally among the directors, but every head was turned away. With trembling hands, he signed his resignation as Chief Executive Officer, relinquishing all his authority. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I took the silver pen, signed the federal reinstatement forms that Walter Jennings had placed on the table, and pushed them back. The lawyer checked the signatures, verified that the cryptographic token was active, and immediately uploaded the document to the federal database. On the screen at the end of the table, the compliance dashboard began to update, the red warning indicators turning back to a steady, peaceful green. The system was unlocked. I stood up, closed my leather notebook, and placed it inside my briefcase, alongside my silver pen. The board members sat in complete silence, watching my every movement as if I were a volatile system that could shut down again at any moment. I walked out of the boardroom, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind me, leaving them in the quiet room to manage the financial wreckage and the aftermath of the fire they had built. It was no longer my responsibility to keep them afloat. I walked out of the building and into the warm afternoon air of Arlington, feeling the heavy burden of 15 years lift off my shoulders, ready to begin my new consulting career on my own terms.